Welcome back. We're here wrapping up variations on the standard treatment on page 293. We're just talking about true speech and how it is grounded in another. This other in question is the analyst. Lacan is here working it toward the top of 293 with the paragraph. It is to the extent that the analyst manages to silence the intermediate discourse in himself in order to open himself up to the chain of true speech, that he can interpolate his revelatory interpretation. So part of the task of analysis is to silence the intermediate discourse in oneself in order to be open to the patient or the analysand's true speech. That is not easy, but it does connect with the earlier theme we discussed of playing dead, playing dumb, and embracing the performance of ignorance. Whether you feel it or not, playing dumb and dead is important because that silencing of oneself as a knowledge-seeking ego is important somehow for allowing the truth of the analysand's speech to be revealed. Let's see how this unfolds. Moving forward from 293, the next important passage along these lines pops up on 297. We're about 4 pages from the end of this essay. Indeed, the analyst cannot follow this path unless he recognizes in his own knowledge the symptom of his own ignorance. So here at the top, in this paragraph that begins, indeed, we're talking about recognizing in one's knowledge symptoms of one's own ignorance. The analyst has to do this kind of work. This is part of what it would mean to become a psychoanalyst. In the properly analytic sense that the symptom is the return of the repressed in a compromise formation, and that repression here as elsewhere constitutes the censorship of truth. So again, what we're getting at here is truth. And part of what needs to happen is to recognize in one's field of knowledge symptoms of one's own ignorance. In the field of knowledge, we recognize its limits, the limits of our own knowledge, symptoms of our own ignorance, even in the midst of knowing, conscious, waking, thoroughly intentful discourse. Now, this could be regular ego-driven speech, empty speech, Lacan sometimes calls it, that suddenly would be shot through with a stutter or a stammer or a Freudian slip of some kind. That might be a symptom of some part of you as a speaker of which you are ignorant. An unconscious agent just spoke through your discourse and caused your speech to stammer. That would be an example of this. That would be the truth finding expression through the censorship of a highly eloquent, artfully wrought, carefully overdetermined ego, trying to control and remain consistent. All the things that in psychoanalysis, the analyst asks the patient or the analysand to ignore. Don't try and be coherent. Just say whatever comes to mind. And don't stop talking. Just keep going. The analyst has a role to play in this. Finding in their own knowledge the symptom of their own ignorance. Going down a little bit more in 297. Lacan, at the end of this paragraph that begins people, talks about every training analysis. This is when you're training to become a psychoanalyst. Is obliged to analyze the reasons why the candidate chose the career of an analyst. So part of what you would have to acknowledge to become a psychoanalyst is you'd have to get at the question of why. What is it about you that wanted to become an analyst? Why were you so compelled by this? The positive fruit of the revelation of ignorance is non-knowledge, which is not a negation of knowledge, but rather its most elaborate form. This is key. Ignorance is not the negation of knowledge. It is, on the contrary, knowledge's most elaborate form. Now, it's tempting here to connect ignorance to the unconscious, because there are things of which you are unaware. You don't remember all the details of that traumatic event that happened to you 20 years ago. But there's a part of you that does remember it, and that part of you is the unconscious. Now, just because your ego doesn't want to think about that and resists all attempts by the unconscious to speak the truth of that horrible event, it doesn't mean it's not there. You are ignorant of it as an ego, As an ego, you are ignorant of that experience. But that doesn't mean that it is a negation of knowledge. It's not the opposite of knowledge, that ignorance. In fact, it's its most elaborate form. The field of ignorance, the field of which you are unaware, is the most elaborate form of knowledge out there. Now that's kind of interesting. That's a weird way to put this. The candidate's training cannot be completed without some action on the part of the master or masters who train him in this non-knowledge. One must be trained in the field of non-knowledge, which is ignorance. Trained in the field of ignorance. Expertise, acute awareness of how ignorance operates. Think about all the implications of this statement. The stake here, again, Lacan reminds us in the middle of page 298, is in accordance with the laws of speech. It is in the analyst as another subject, as other, that the subject finds his own identity. So the goal here, again, is for the analyst to play a certain part in order to help the patient or the analysand find their own identity. And this is a very communicative experience. The experience of analysis is a communicative experience. Communication coming from the word meaning to share, not to unite, not union. It's the munus in communication, meaning to share something with another person. This intersubjective field, something between. Inter means between. Subjectivity is something that we share with others. It's always between us and others that we reside. On 299, last few paragraphs of this essay, Lacan really wants to drive home this point about non-knowledge. The paragraph begins, "The fact is that psychoanalysis, since it progresses essentially in non-knowledge, is tied to," and then he goes through and lists all the other fields that would be extremely important for understanding psychoanalysis. And yet at the same time, look at this. The non-knowledge in question would derive and deal with mathematics, linguistic research, history, symbolology, game theory, set theory, which is a big one for Lacan. All of these other fields of knowledge, complex fields of knowledge, all culminate in the final words of this essay. Learned ignorance. The pathway of a learned ignorance. Or you might refer to this as a learned ignorance. You have learned how to be ignorant. And again, the notion of ignorance here is not the negation of knowledge, but a very elaborate form of non-knowledge. Non-knowledge is the origin and birthplace of truth. Knowledge is not the same as truth. Knowledge, again, has to do with the ego, with consciousness, with intent. Non-knowledge has to do with the unconscious, with truth. Not intent, but effect instead. Ignorance is not non-knowledge in the sense of a negation of knowledge, but rather non-knowledge as knowledge's and ignorance's most elaborate form. Remember that passage on 297. The positive fruit of the revelation of ignorance is non-knowledge, which is not a negation of knowledge, but rather its most elaborate form. To be learned in the field of non-knowledge. Final question for this essay is right at the center of it. What is the ultimate absolute field of non-knowledge? The field of human experience where the human experience itself comes to an end, where knowledge can pass no further, where egos, weak, strong, and otherwise all pass. It's death. The field of non-knowledge ignorance's most elaborate form, knowledge's most elaborate form, is the field of death. And so part of what this learned ignorance yields at the level of analytic experience, again, is an analyst who knows how to play dead, which is to say they're good at performing beyond the field of knowledge. And in doing so, pointing the analysand towards a field of truth that carries them not only to the end of their life, but also points right back to the beginning, to that feeling of impotence, that touch of death that Lacan referred to as the fragmented body. This is part of what's at stake here. And as you blast forward into Lacan's work and you get into Seminar 17 and the 4 discourses of psychoanalysis, you can see in the discourse of the analyst, in the bottom left-hand quadrant, S2, which is a kind of knowledge, but it occupies a field of ignorance. The truth of the analyst's position is that their knowledge has been shoved into or gleaned from the field of non-knowledge, of ignorance. This is partly how we can read the discourse of the analyst. Another more simple way is to just say they hide their knowledge by playing dumb, by playing dead. And this is the opportunity structure in which the empty speech of a patient or an analysand can take on full proportions, in which an empty speech can become true. And the truth here, again, has nothing to do with the external world. It has to do with the subject's relationship to themselves. True, full speech in Lacanian psychoanalysis is speech in which the subject re-subjectivizes their past, transforming their past into their history by owning it, by coming to terms with all the things that have happened to them, even and especially the worst things, and recognizing that had those things not occurred, they wouldn't be the person they are today. And they own that past. They have a stake in it. They understand their role in the co-maintenance of that past. That past is as intersubjective as the present in which they transform it into their history. These are some of the big themes that are coming out of Lacan's work in the 1950s. And this essay, Variations on the Standard Treatment, is a great place to start tracing them further.